development in terms of the latest, in terms of the outbreak of COVID-19, novel coronavirus, COVID-19, in terms of South Africa's efforts of evacuating citizens out of there. And we're joined now by our foreign editor, Sophie Mokoena. Sophie, your thoughts about this briefing?
I think the briefing was quite comprehensive. You heard the minister outlining the state of readiness from our side as a country, but also looking at the evacuation process. And we know that that is the project for the South African Defence Force. If you recall, during that Nigeria building that collapsed and where the Defence Force had to take over to repatriate the bodies, this time around, the Defence Force is repatriating human beings who are alive, who are well, as we are told right now, because none of them has been identified as a person or who had tested positive with the coronavirus. But the reality is these South Africans find themselves in the area where you have this disease ravaging that part of the province. But fortunately, based on the information, the South Africans who are coming home or who are supposed to come home, none of them has got the signs of the coronavirus. This is something that as a country we must take into consideration, because we have a tendency to stigmatize people, and therefore I think we have to deal with that information with sensitivity that it deserves. We know that the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, when he spoke to SABC 3 weeks ago, he raised a concern that countries are kind of stigmatizing China in particular based on this disease. But when you look at the health system of China, it's one of the best around the world. That is why you even see many high-profile leaders flying to China to get medical attention. And therefore, it doesn't mean that China is not doing much to try and deal with this disease. We saw them building hospitals in very short space of time and equipping those hospitals. But the population in China is quite huge. So when you have 1,000 people having this challenge, or 2,000 people who have died, it's a small number when you look at the size of China. But indeed, as the world, we have to be on standby, but also we have to be vigilant at all times to ensure that this disease doesn't spread. But the other issue that we have to take into consideration, many people are asking why Sub-Sahara, particularly African continent, is not affected. That's not the reason. The reason is that it's summer. When you look at areas that are affected, it's winter time. And therefore, that is why the continent stands ready to ensure that we don't have challenges. We know that at the African Union, you also have the Disease Control Center that is getting information from all member countries, and they are sharing information with all member countries so that all member countries are ready for this challenge. America, your most sophisticated democratic country, has got a challenge, and therefore, I think it's so wrong for people to try and stigmatize the African countries and asking questions why we don't have this, because Africa is a continent of diseases. We should be celebrating the fact that for now we are able to control and we are vigilant, and we must continue to do so.
I just want to reiterate on what you said, that the people who are supposed to be brought back are in the clear, but also the Minister of Health reiterating that, saying that South Africa has been fortunate that to date there has been no case of COVID in South Africa, but also saying that, warning South Africans to not be short-sighted and to create suspicion and paranoia.
Yes, for now in the country we don't have any person who has tested positive, but we do have 2 South Africans who are currently in Japan, who were on the cruise, who have tested positive, and they are still there, and they are receiving necessary attention that side. But for now, in South Africa, in the SADC region, if I were to even emphasize, we don't have a case yet. But South Africa is vigilant. And the former Minister of Health, Motsoaledi, making an example of the Ebola crisis, you know that it was a huge story. People were panicking and South Africans were asking hard questions. But to date, South Africa didn't report any such case. And also our systems, our health system, the testing sites, are being recognized internationally. That is why many African countries, when they have that, when they do have suspicions and those cases that they suspect are linked to corona, they do send the samples to South Africa. It's just that South Africa is not bragging to announce every day that we've received so many samples from such a country. They're treating this as a private matter for respective countries. But South Africa is already doing a lot on the continent to assist the continent itself, as Minister Zweli has indicated.
Sophie Mokoena is our foreign editor, having a lot of focus on this story. But let's go back to that interministerial, the venue of that interministerial briefing, and our reporter Chriselda Lewis is standing by. Chriselda, what did you pick up from this briefing?
So, Desiree, what really came out quite clearly is that South Africa is indicating that it is at an advanced stage at this moment of, executing the evacuation of about the official figure now, which has risen from the last time that the presidency had communicated. There's 201 South Africans in Wuhan that have been picked up by the Department of International Relations, and 151 of those have indicated that they want to come back home, 16 indicating that they do not want to come back, and about 34 there, Desiree, who the Department of International Relations is still looking for at this stage. Quite a strong call to South Africans who are perhaps watching this media briefing via our digital space, that if they have areas of concern, they should contact the various embassies around the world if they do have concerns pertaining to that. But South Africa indicating, of course, that it is ready for that evacuation, and essentially saying that there are 84 sites that have basically been looked at in terms of inspection for the quarantine of these 151 South Africans, but they're not indicating at this stage where exactly the site will be for this quarantine to take place. In terms of the time frame, which was certainly a stickler in terms of the briefing here itself, Desiree, when will the South Africans be evacuated from Wuhan, indicating that from the time that the decision had been made during the course of the week that the South Africans should be evacuated, between 7 and 10 working days, the plane should have left South Africa to go and pick up those citizens in Wuhan. And in terms of, there's been a lot of talk there, Desiree, about whether this extension of evacuation would possibly extend to other areas of concern as well. The Minister of Health, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, indicating that while there are areas of concern, for example, in South Korea, which has quite a number of cases that have been increased in terms of the coronavirus, at this point, South Africa is more concerned, or is sticking to the evacuation of its citizens in the epicenter of the coronavirus. So we're talking about Wuhan City, the Hubei province. So at this stage, South Africa is not making any decision pertaining to the evacuation of South Africans anywhere else apart from the epicenter of the virus itself. So at this stage, of course, we know on the African continent that you have cases in Algeria, Nigeria, as well as Egypt. But South Africa is saying that it is on standby for any eventuality. It is ready in this instance to ensure that if anything does happen, it has all the measures in place to ensure that it is able to contain the virus, confirming once again that there are no cases of the coronavirus in South Africa at this point. In terms of the quarantine itself, also indicating that the staff who will be will be on that aircraft that will come from Wuhan City. It is a chartered aircraft that they will ensure that also the staff on there are screened as well. Pre-screening will take place before they get on the aircraft. On the aircraft itself, they will come to South Africa, and there are processes that are being put in place to ensure that there is no contact between those South Africans and the rest of the citizens. But it's quite important to also point out, Desiree, that the Health Ministry is reassuring that none of those 151 South Africans who've agreed to be evacuated or who want to be evacuated from Wuhan City have picked up any signs of contracting fighting the coronavirus. So the issue of the quarantine for 21 days is a precautionary measure that South Africa has put in place to ensure that they are clear.
Chriselda, in your Q&A session, you touched on your conversations with some family members. Do you think they feel reassured at this moment?
Well, Desiree, I'll know in the next few minutes after I speak to them. But there was a great concern indeed, many of them wanting to know where they can hear what the South African government sentiments are. And I can certainly assure you quite a number of those concerned family members had been watching this broadcast, trying to get some assurance. I'll speak to them as soon as I get off this particular line with you. But I think it does go a long way, Desiree, in assuring these families that the South African government is doing something to ensure that they get their loved ones out of Wuhan city, which is the epicenter of this coronavirus outbreak. In terms of the time frames, if we're talking about between 7 to 10 days, then that should give some kind of assurance that the preparations for this evacuation are certainly at an advanced stage. As many of the panelists here, the Interministerial Committee have agreed that it is at an advanced stage, and so that should serve as some kind of consolation that in the next perhaps couple of days, there should be some movement with regard to getting those 151 South Africans out of Wuhan city.
Thanks for bringing us up to date. Chriselda Lewis is coming to us from that venue for the interministerial approach to the COVID-19, the fight against this scourge. Sophie Mokoena still with us, our foreign editor. Sophie, in terms of the stigma, what can be done to assure South Africans that this is being approached scientifically and everyone is, as things stand now, safe?
I think government must use all the communication platforms that we have in the country. For example, the media. You can also make sure that there are leaflets, particularly in areas where you have many people, like your taxi ranks, your stations, train stations, your airports, so that people are aware. But also, I think the Department of Education must play an important role to educate the young ones, particularly in schools, in terms of what they must do, hygiene. The issue of hygiene now is very critical for teachers or educators to ensure that learners from schools, they are aware and they are able to also educate their own families, like it was done in olden days, in our times. We know that our parents, they didn't have access to information, but would get particular education if there was a particular outbreak in terms of what we must do. And our teachers, our educators would ask us to share the information with the family. The higher education must do the same, and all sectors of society must do that. The churches and the NGOs, we must all work together. It must be all hands on deck.
Let's just look ahead to the new week. We've just heard from the Interministerial Committee. What are we hearing from the World Health Organization and the United Nations?
Well, the World Health Organization, every day they do have a media briefing, and the head of the institution always give information and updates in terms of what's happening, but also emphasizing the fact that the world must work together to ensure that we are able to control this disease. But unfortunately, looking at the international markets, including South Africa, there has been a negative reaction, and people are concerned that a biggest economy, the second largest economy like China, is experiencing these challenges, and therefore we are likely to see a recession because moving goods and services, but also in people to China now, it is a challenge. We saw a reported case in Washington yesterday. One person has died, and when it touches America, the largest economy, now we have these two big economies handling this matter. On the continent, you have Nigeria having this problem, and you have Egypt, the fastest growing economy on the continent. And therefore, I think it must be all hands on deck to ensure that we are able to manage this situation. We shouldn't find ourselves in recession because it will be a serious problem for countries such as South Africa that is already having economic challenges.
Thanks for talking to us. Sophie Mokoena is the SABC foreign editor. Let's take a break.